Logan Hayes walked into that restaurant expecting nothing. He left carrying something he didn't have a name for yet. She was sharp, guarded, and sitting across from him like she'd already decided he wasn't worth her time. Except she stayed anyway. And when the lies came later, not from strangers, but from the past he thought he'd buried, everything he'd quietly built began to collapse. He almost lost his daughter's stability, his career, and the first woman who ever made him want to stop running. Almost. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The hostess at Callaway's had the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, the sort of expression that came from years of seating people who were already unhappy before they sat down. She led Logan Hayes to a corner booth near the back, and he followed her without saying much, the way he did most things, quietly, efficiently, his eyes doing the work his mouth wouldn't. He was early. He was always early. It was the kind of habit that had nothing to do with eagerness and everything to do with control. If you arrived first, you could see the room before anyone saw you. He slid into the booth and set his phone face down on the table. The restaurant was the kind of place that made him mildly uncomfortable. Not because it was too expensive, though it was, but because everything about it was designed to signal importance. The lighting was amber and low. The menu had no prices. The water came in a glass bottle nobody had asked for. Logan picked it up and poured himself a glass just to have something to do with his hands. Marcus had texted him 3 times in the last hour. "She's perfect for you, man. Just trust me." Then, "Seriously, you'll thank me later." Then 15 minutes ago, a string of emojis that Logan hadn't bothered to decode. He'd shown up anyway, not because he trusted Marcus's judgment. Marcus had once confidently recommended a dentist who turned out to be operating out of a strip mall with no receptionist, but because 7 years of saying no to everything had started to feel like its own kind of problem. He wasn't nervous. That would have required some baseline of hope, and Logan had long since made peace with keeping hope at arm's length. He was just here, present, willing to sit through one dinner with one stranger and then go home to his daughter and his apartment and the particular silence he'd spent years learning not to resent. Sophie would be asleep by the time he got back. His neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, had promised to stay until 10, and Sophie was 6 now, old enough to fall asleep on her own, but still young enough to want someone in the next room. Logan had kissed her forehead before he left, and she'd told him very seriously that he should smile more. "You look like you're always thinking about something sad," she'd said. He hadn't argued with her. The hostess reappeared and seated someone across the room, a woman who moved through the restaurant the way certain people moved through every room, like the space was adjusting itself to accommodate her. She wasn't performing it. That was the thing. Some people entered places loudly, wanting to be noticed. This woman simply arrived, and the room rearranged itself accordingly. She was tall, dark-haired, and dressed in the quiet way that serious money dressed. No logos, no flash, just fit and fabric, and the kind of watch that didn't need to announce itself. Logan watched her for exactly 3 seconds before looking back at the water glass in front of him. He was not the kind of man who stared. When the hostess walked the woman toward his booth, something shifted in Logan's posture without his permission. He sat up slightly. He didn't know why. She stopped at his table and looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately place. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't hostility either. It was the look of someone rapidly processing a situation and choosing, in real time, how to respond to it. "You're Logan," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, I'm Ava." She sat down. She didn't smile, but she didn't leave either, and something about that felt significant in a way Logan couldn't articulate. He'd half expected whoever showed up to take one look at him. 32, average-looking, the permanent exhaustion of single parenthood etched faintly beneath his eyes, and invent a reason to bail. Instead, she set her small bag on the seat beside her and reached for the water bottle and poured her own glass with the same practicality he'd used 30 seconds ago. "They didn't tell you much about me," she said. "They told me your name and that you liked coffee. That's about it." "Danielle told me you were funny." She looked at him over the rim of her glass. "I'm not seeing it yet." "It usually takes a few minutes to warm up." "That's what people say when they're not actually funny." "Fair point." The waiter appeared and they ordered drinks. Bourbon for him, sparkling water for her. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Logan had been on enough awkward first dates in his late 20s to know that silence was the real test. Most people couldn't sit in it. They filled it with noise, questions, performed enthusiasm. Ava sat in it like she lived there. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure. Did Marcus and Danielle actually think this through, or was this some kind of entertainment project for them?" Logan set his glass down. "What makes you say that?" Ava tilted her head slightly. "Because Danielle thinks she's subtle and she's not. She was very casual about suggesting this place, which she knows I like, on a night she knew I was free, with someone she'd described as really down to earth, not your usual type." She paused, which is a diplomatic way of saying she thought the contrast would be funny. Logan looked at her for a moment. "She told Marcus you were too intense for most guys and needed someone who could handle it." Ava let out a short, genuine laugh. Just one beat of it, like she'd been caught off guard and hadn't had time to suppress it. "Of course she did." "I'm not offended, for the record." "Why not?" "Because I don't know you well enough to be offended. And because intense isn't an insult." She studied him for a second. Not in a measuring way exactly, more like she was recalibrating something. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd spend the first 10 minutes telling me about himself." "I don't really do that." "No," she said. "I can tell." Ava Kensington had been running Kensington Meridian Group for 4 years. She'd taken the company from a mid-size asset management firm to a regional powerhouse with offices in 3 cities, and she'd done it largely by being the person in the room who asked the questions no one else wanted to ask. She was 30 years old, owned an apartment on the 14th floor of a building with a doorman who'd learned to simply nod as she passed, and had last been in something resembling a relationship 18 months ago. A situation that had ended not with a fight, but with a mutual, exhausted acknowledgement that neither of them had really been present for most of it. She did not tell Logan any of this at dinner. What she told him was considerably less. What she asked him about was Sophie. Logan hadn't meant to bring his daughter up. He told himself in the car that he would keep things surface level, professional almost, and see if there was any actual chemistry before revealing the parts of his life that tended to change people's calculations. But Ava had asked, mid-meal, whether he had kids, in the same tone she'd used to ask whether he wanted to share the appetizer, matter of fact, no loaded freight behind it, and he'd said yes before he could perform the casual delay he usually used. "How old?" "6. Her name's Sophie." "Do you have her full-time?" "Yeah." He moved the food around on his plate for a second. "Her mom left when Sophie was 2. It's been me and her since then." Ava didn't do the thing people usually did, which was make the face. The soft, sympathetic, slightly pitying face that preceded the phrase "that must be so hard." She just nodded, like he'd given her information and she was filing it accurately. "What's she like?" Ava asked. Nobody asked that. They asked how Logan managed, or whether it was difficult, or what the custody arrangement looked like. Nobody asked what Sophie was like. Logan stopped. "She's got opinions about everything. Furniture arrangements, how I fold towels, what music goes with different meals. She told me last week that grilled cheese requires acoustic guitar, and that I need to stop playing anything with drums during dinner." Ava smiled. Actually smiled this time, something smaller and more private than what she'd wear in a meeting. "She sounds exhausting." "She's the best person I know," Logan said, and he meant it so completely that it came out flat, no sentimentality attached, just fact. Ava was quiet for a moment. "That's a nice thing to say about a 6-year-old. She's earned it." They stayed until the restaurant started setting up for closing, which neither of them had noticed until a waiter began hovering at a polite distance. 2.5 hours had passed. Logan had not once checked his phone. Outside on the sidewalk, the evening had gone cool, and Ava wrapped one arm across herself in that half-self-conscious way people did when they didn't want to admit they were cold. Logan's car was half a block north. Hers, he guessed from the black town car idling across the street, was considerably closer. "This wasn't what I expected," she said again. "You said that already." "It's still true." He looked at her. There was something here he wasn't imagining it. But Logan Hayes had spent enough years making cautious decisions to know that the feeling of something being right was not the same as something being right. He kept the gap between them at a polite 3 feet and told himself he was being reasonable. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "If you want to. No setup, no Marcus, no Danielle." Ava considered this. She had the look of someone running rapid calculations that she wasn't going to share. "I'll text you," she said. "Okay. I might actually do it. I'll assume you will until I hear otherwise." Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite warmth, but something in the neighborhood of both. "Good night, Logan." "Good night." He walked to his car without looking back. Not because he wasn't tempted, but because he'd learned a long time ago that looking back was its own kind of message, and he wasn't ready to send it. She texted on Wednesday. Not a long text. Not warm. "Are you free Saturday afternoon? There's a market near my office I've been meaning to check." He read it 3 times and then typed back, "I can make Saturday work." "What time?" Her response came 40 minutes later, which he suspected was deliberate. "Noon. I'll send you the address." Logan stared at the screen for a moment. Sophie was at the kitchen table behind him, working on a drawing she'd been very secretive about for the past hour. He turned around. "Bud?" Do you want to go to Mrs. Aldridge's on Saturday for a few hours? She mentioned she'd teach you how to make those cookies you like." Sophie looked up. She had paint on her left cheek, which she was unaware of, and the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was a good or bad idea. "The ones with the jam in the middle?" "Those are the ones." "Okay." She looked back at her drawing. "Are you going on a date?" Logan blinked. "What makes you think that?" "Because you have your texting face." "I don't have a texting face." "You do," she said, not looking up. "You get very still, and you read it too many times." He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "You're going to be a problem when you're older, you know that?" "Mrs. Park at school says I'm perceptive." She said the word carefully, having clearly practiced it. I didn't know what it meant, but she said it was a compliment. "It is," he said. "It definitely is." The market was an outdoor thing spread through 3 city blocks on the east side, vendors selling produce and vintage furniture, and handmade things that cost considerably more than they looked like they should. Ava was already there when he arrived, standing at a stall that sold loose-leaf tea, reading the handwritten labels with focused attention. She was in jeans and a plain dark jacket. Logan registered involuntarily that the absence of the professional armor she'd worn at dinner made her look both less formidable and somehow more so, which was a paradox he chose not to think about too carefully. "You're on time," she said without turning around. "I'm always on time." "People who are always on time have control issues." "Probably," he agreed. She finally looked at him and the corner of her mouth moved. She bought 2 packets of tea she probably didn't need and they walked, which turned out to be how they were most comfortable with each other. Side by side, with something else to look at. Space for conversation without the pressure of direct confrontation. She asked about his work. He was a senior project manager at Aldgate Construction Group, overseeing commercial builds in the mid-city corridor. He explained it plainly, without the inflation people sometimes added when they felt they had something to prove. She listened the way she seemed to listen to everything, which was completely and without visible judgment. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Most days." "What does a bad day look like?" "I've got a colleague," he said after a pause, "who's been trying to edge me out of a contract for the last 6 months. He's—" Logan stopped. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" "He's got friends in the right places, and I don't." Ava glanced at him. "And you just accept that?" "I pick my battles. That's what people say when they're afraid of losing." He looked at her sideways. "Do you always say what you're thinking?" "No," she said simply. "But I usually say more of it than people expect." They stopped at a stall selling hand-ground spices, and the vendor, an older man with weathered hands, held out samples on small wooden spoons. They tasted cardamom and something smoky Logan couldn't identify, and for a minute they didn't talk at all, and it was comfortable in a way Logan hadn't expected comfort to feel. "I'm not afraid of losing," he said eventually. "I just don't think fighting every fight is worth the damage." Even when not fighting is also costing you something? He didn't have an answer to that, or he had one, but it was buried somewhere he hadn't dug in a while. Let's keep walking, he said. His colleague's name was Derek Solis. Logan had never told anyone the full shape of what had happened between them, partly because he preferred to appear unaffected, and partly because the full shape was more complicated than he wanted to explain. Derek was charismatic and quick, and had cultivated relationships with 3 of the firm's senior partners over years of deliberate social investment: dinners, golf, the right amount of remembered detail about people's families and preferences. He was good at his job. He was also, quietly and persistently, good at making Logan look like he wasn't. It had started small: a misquoted email in a team meeting, a missed attribution on a project report, the kind of thing that was hard to call out without looking paranoid or petty. Then larger, a client walkthrough that Logan should have led, redirected to Derek at the last minute with an apologetic shrug from management. A performance review that used language Logan didn't recognize as describing his actual performance. He hadn't told anyone, not his friends, not his HR contact, and definitely not the woman he was slowly, against his better instincts, beginning to care about. He told himself this was prudence. He wasn't ready to have that conversation. He didn't want to introduce complications before there was even a clear foundation. He'd figure it out on his own, the way he figured most things out. This was, as he would later understand with the specific clarity of someone who has learned something the hard way, a mistake. The 3rd time they saw each other, Ava had a bad day. Logan could see it before she said anything, a tightness around her jaw, the slightly compressed way she moved when she was managing something internally. They'd planned to walk along the riverfront after work, a loose plan that neither of them had built expectations around, and he'd met her outside her building at 6:30. Hard day? He asked. There's a board member, she said, and then stopped. I don't want to talk about work. Okay. I want to walk fast. Let's walk fast. They did. For about 15 minutes, they barely spoke, moving at a pace that wasn't quite angry, but had purpose behind it, and Logan matched it without comment. He didn't ask questions or offer reassurances. He just kept pace. Eventually, she slowed. The river was gray-green in the early evening light, and the path was mostly empty. Thank you for not asking, she said. You said you didn't want to talk about it. Most people ask anyway. I've noticed you say what you mean. It seemed reasonable to take you at your word. Ava looked at the water. I have this board member, Carl Weiss, who has decided that the expansion into the Northern District is a mistake and has been running a quiet campaign to convince 2 other members to vote against it. He does it over lunches I'm not invited to, through channels I can't officially address. She paused. Which is its own art form, honestly. Sounds exhausting. It is. And the worst part is he's not entirely wrong about the risk. He's just wrong about whether the risk is worth taking. Logan looked at her. What do you think? I think you don't build anything by only moving when you're certain. She turned slightly toward him. But I also know that I've made decisions this year that I was certain about, and they turned out to be wrong. So I'm having a complicated relationship with my own instincts right now. Which decisions? She hesitated, and Logan saw it, the exact moment she decided whether to answer honestly or perform the version of herself that didn't get complicated in front of people. A partnership I ended 6 months ago, she said. A business one. I thought the numbers were clear, and I moved fast, and the other firm had information I didn't, and now they're doing well, and we lost the connection. She shook her head. It's not the loss. It's that I was so sure. Being wrong about something once doesn't mean your instincts are broken. I know that. But you don't quite believe it yet. She looked at him with an expression that was almost surprised. No, she said quietly. Not yet. They walked for another hour. By the time they stopped at a bench near the north end of the path, the light had gone bronze and the river was doing something beautiful that neither of them mentioned. They sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and Logan was acutely aware of the 3 inches between them in a way that felt disproportionate to its physical reality. Sophie asked me if I was going on dates, he said, on Saturday before I came to meet you. Ava made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. What did you tell her? I told her I was going to meet a friend. And what did she say? She said, and I quote, "Is she nice, Or is she too busy to be nice? He paused. She has a theory that busy people forget to be nice. That's remarkably astute for 6. She's going to be absolutely insufferable as a teenager. Ava smiled, and this time it stayed. I'd like to meet her sometime. Logan looked at her. The 3 inches between their shoulders hadn't changed. Yeah? If that's okay? It's okay, he said, and meant it. What Logan didn't mention, because he was still performing the version of himself that had everything managed, was that the situation at work had escalated. There had been a complaint. Informal, officially, but pointed, raised through a third party to the HR director about Logan's management style on the Garfield Avenue project. The complaint alleged that Logan had been dismissive of a junior team member's input and had taken credit for work that wasn't his. Neither allegation was true, but they'd been filed by someone who knew how to file things in ways that made them difficult to quickly dismiss. Logan had been called in for a preliminary conversation with HR. He'd answered the questions directly and calmly. He'd been told it would be reviewed. He'd gone home that evening and made Sophie spaghetti and listened to her describe in exhaustive detail a disagreement she'd had at school involving a jump rope and someone named Megan, and he had not said a single word about what had happened at the office. This was how he'd always operated. You handled your own problems. You didn't put weight on the people who were already close to you. You didn't let the messy things bleed into the good ones. He believed this so deeply, he hadn't examined it in years. The 4th time they saw each other was dinner again. Different restaurant, lower key, and afterward they sat in his car in the parking structure for 40 minutes because neither of them wanted to end the conversation. Ava had asked him directly about his past relationship, not in a prying way, but in the way she asked most things, which was like she'd decided the question was worth asking and was prepared for an honest answer. It was short, he said. Sophie's mother and we were together for about a year before Sophie. It wasn't, he exhaled. We wanted different things. She wanted a different life. When Sophie was born, she tried, but she wasn't built for it, and I think staying would have made her worse, not better. Do you still have contact with her? No, she moved out of state. He tapped his fingers once on the steering wheel. Sophie asks sometimes. I try to answer honestly without saying things that would make it harder for her. That's a careful line to walk. Yeah. Ava was quiet for a moment. There was someone, she said. Before, maybe 2 years ago, we were good at the surface of things. He understood the professional world I moved in, knew how to talk to the people around me. But he had this habit of... She stopped. He smoothed things over too fast. Any conflict, any tension, it disappeared within hours. No argument ever actually resolved. He just made it go away. That sounds exhausting in a different way. It was. I kept feeling like I was standing in a room where all the furniture was nailed down. Nothing could move. Nothing could breathe. She looked out the windshield. I ended it, and he acted completely blindsided, which was its own information. How so? It told me he hadn't been paying attention to me either. He'd been paying attention to the surface. Logan absorbed that. I don't want to give you the surface, he said, and the words came out more direct than he'd intended, which was becoming a pattern with her. Ava turned her head to look at him. I know, she said. That's why I keep showing up. And then something shifted, or rather, something that had already shifted was finally acknowledged between them, in the particular way that things which have been building finally arrive not with drama, but with the quiet weight of inevitability. He leaned toward her slightly. She met him. The kiss was brief and careful, the way first kisses were when both people had reasons to be careful, and when it ended, they both sat back and didn't immediately speak. For the record, Ava said after a moment, I texted Marcus and Danielle separately after our first date and told them it was fine. Logan laughed. A real one, unguarded. That's diplomatic. I'm the CEO of a company, she said dryly. I've perfected diplomatic. He did not tell her about Derek Solis that night. He meant to. He opened his mouth twice during dinner and redirected each time, convincing himself it wasn't the right moment, that they were still building something and introducing the complication felt premature. And there was another thing he didn't tell her. Smaller, he thought, but connected in ways he wasn't tracking yet. Before Sophie, Before the stable career and the careful choices and the apartment with the good natural light, there had been a period in Logan's mid-20s that he'd largely filed away and stopped referencing. A year in which he'd made decisions he wasn't proud of. Not illegal, nothing catastrophic, but ethically murky. Pressure at an old job. A situation where he'd gone along with something he should have pushed back on. He'd left that position within the year, quietly, and had spent the years since building the kind of record that made that period feel like someone else's life. He'd never lied about it, but he'd never volunteered it either. He told himself that this too was prudent. He had no way of knowing, then, that someone from that chapter had never quite stopped watching him, that what looked like the past was actually a clock. On a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the blind date at Calloway's, Logan picked Sophie up from school, stopped for ice cream at the place on Meridian she loved, listened to 45 minutes of second-grade politics, put her to bed, and sat down on the couch in the quiet of his apartment. His phone had a voicemail from his HR director. He hadn't listened to it yet. He poured a glass of water he didn't drink and looked at the ceiling and thought about Ava. The way she leaned forward when she was interested in something, the particular quality of her attention, the way she'd kissed him back like she'd already made her decision before he'd made his. He thought about Sophie asking if she was nice, and Ava saying she'd like to meet her. He thought about the voicemail. He pressed play. Logan, this is Patricia from HR. We've received additional documentation related to the concern I mentioned last week. I'd like to schedule some time to speak on Friday. This is staying informal for now, but I want you to be aware that the scope has expanded somewhat. Call me back when you can. He sat with that for a long moment. The apartment was very quiet. Sophie's breathing, faintly, from down the hall. He thought about telling Ava. He opened his texts, her name at the top, and then set the phone face down on the cushion beside him. Not yet, he told himself. You don't even know what you're dealing with yet. It was such a reasonable-sounding lie. He closed his eyes and listened to the quiet, and did not hear the thing that was already moving toward him. From the past, he'd decided wasn't worth discussing. Friday's meeting with Patricia from HR was 15 minutes long and left Logan colder than the air conditioning could account for. The documentation she'd received was detailed. 3 incidents, dated and described, with accompanying emails that Logan did not recognize, that bore his name in the sender field and said things he had never written. An alleged conversation overheard by a colleague, a claim from someone whose name Patricia would not yet share. Who submitted this? Logan asked. I can't disclose that at this stage. Are you saying someone fabricated emails with my name on them? Patricia's expression was neutral and professional and gave him nothing. I'm saying we're required to review anything submitted through the formal process. I want to give you every opportunity to respond, he responded. He answered each item point by point, calmly, with the precise recall of someone who genuinely remembered the situations being described and knew with certainty that the descriptions were wrong. Patricia took notes. When he walked out of her office, he stood in the hallway for a moment outside her door and did the math, quickly and without sentiment, and arrived at a name. Derek Solis. He didn't have proof. He had the geometry of the thing, the access, the motive, the particular craft of it, the way it was designed to look credible without being verifiable. Derek was good at this. Logan had watched him work for 2 years. He drove home. He picked up Sophie from after school. He made dinner. He answered her questions about what giraffes ate and why the sky turned pink and whether it was true that you could sneeze with your eyes open. And he did not call Ava. He would handle it. He always handled things. He was, in ways he could not yet see, running out of runway. The weekend after the HR meeting, Logan took Sophie to the park on Callister Avenue, the one with the old wooden climbing structure she'd been obsessed with since she was 4. She'd outgrown the baby swings but still couldn't resist them, and he watched her pump her legs with total commitment, her sneakers cutting arcs against the gray October sky. He sat on a bench with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He'd spent Friday night and most of Saturday running the problem through his head the way he ran project logistics. Systematically, without sentiment, looking for the gap. The emails Patricia had shown him were convincing. That was the part that kept snagging. They weren't sloppy forgeries. Whoever had assembled them understood how Logan wrote, the cadence of it, the kind of language he used in professional settings. They'd gotten close enough that someone who didn't know him well might not notice the wrongness of them. Derek Solis knew how Logan wrote. They'd been on the same team for 2 years. They'd collaborated on reports, exchanged hundreds of internal messages, sat across from each other in dozens of project meetings. Logan had no proof. That was the problem. He had geometry. Who had access? Who had motive? Who had the particular cold patience for something like this? But geometry wasn't proof, and HR didn't work on geometry. Dad! He looked up. Sophie had abandoned the swings and was standing in front of him with her hands on her hips, in an expression that was uncomfortably reminiscent of someone he'd been spending time with lately. You're doing the sad thinking face again. I'm not sad. Your forehead does a thing when you're sad, and it's doing the thing. He reached out and pulled her in for a quick sideways hug she tolerated for about 4 seconds before wriggling free. I'm fine, bud. Just thinking about work. Is it the person who's trying to make you look bad? Logan went still. What? Sophie shrugged, examining a loose thread on her jacket sleeve. I heard you on the phone. You were talking to Uncle Marcus and you said someone at work was making things hard. I didn't hear all of it. He made a note to himself about the acoustics of their apartment. Yeah, something like that. It's complicated. Did you tell them the truth? I'm working on it. She looked at him with her direct, unblinking 6-year-old assessment. You always tell me the truth is the fastest way to fix things. I know. So why is it complicated? He didn't have a good answer to that, or rather the honest answer was that fixing things wasn't quite the right frame. Sometimes the truth came out too slow, and in the meantime the damage was already running ahead of it. But explaining that to Sophie felt like introducing a piece of the world he was in no hurry to give her. Let's get lunch, he said. Sophie gave him one more look that suggested she wasn't done with the topic, but she was 6, and there was food on offer, so she let it go. Well, Ava texted him Sunday evening. Are you free Tuesday night? There's a documentary playing at the Rialto I want to see, and I'd rather not go alone. He typed back, What kind of documentary? The kind that makes you uncomfortable and then you argue about it for an hour after. My favorite kind. He smiled at his phone in the privacy of his living room. I'm in. She sent the time and the address and nothing else. And Logan set the phone down and thought about the HR meeting for the 400th time, and thought about telling her, and thought about not telling her, and went back and forth on it in the low-grade way he'd been going back and forth on it for 4 days. The logic he kept landing on was thin but felt structural. He didn't know yet what the HR process would produce. It was still informal. Patricia had used that word twice. If he told Ava now, he'd be introducing a problem that might resolve itself before it became a real problem, and he'd have put that weight on something that was still fragile and new. Better to wait. Better to know more first. What he wasn't tracking, because he'd gotten skilled at not tracking it, was that this logic pattern was old. It predated Derek, predated his job, predated most things. He'd been applying it since his early 20s, the idea that protecting people from complications was the same as protecting the relationship, that managing information was the same as being careful, that not saying difficult things was a form of consideration rather than a form of distance. He'd never examined that assumption closely enough to notice it was costing him. The documentary was about financial collapse, specifically a mid-sized insurance company that had imploded 12 years ago due to a combination of internal fraud, institutional blindness, and the particular kind of organizational culture where everyone could see the problem and no one could say it aloud. It was uncomfortable, as promised. The filmmakers had gotten access to internal communications, and watching the executives' emails appear on screen, cheerful, mundane, deliberately unseen, was the specific kind of horror that came from recognition. Afterward, they walked to a Thai place 2 blocks from the theater that Ava knew, and they got a corner table and ordered food they ate without paying much attention to because they were already deep into the argument she'd predicted. The CFO knew, Ava said. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He had the reports. He chose the interpretation that was easier. He chose the interpretation that kept his life intact, Logan said. That's the same thing. Is it? People don't usually blow up their own lives on principle. Some people do. Some people, he agreed, but most people have mortgages and kids and they tell themselves that they can fix it quietly and they wait too long. Ava pointed at him with her chopsticks. That's a very sympathetic read. I'm not sympathetic to what he did. I'm just saying I understand the mechanics. The mechanics of choosing comfort over accountability. The mechanics of being afraid and making the wrong call because of it. He met her eyes. Those aren't the same as not knowing the difference. She was quiet for a moment, considering him. You sound like you've thought about this kind of thing. Everyone has situations they handled wrong. That's deflection. It's also true. She let it sit for a few seconds, and Logan felt the familiar pull to redirect, to move the conversation somewhere easier, and stayed where he was instead, just barely. I had a situation early in my career, he said. Not the whole shape of it, just the edge. A manager who was cutting corners on safety reporting. I saw it. I didn't report it immediately. I waited and I watched and I told myself I was gathering more information before I did something. But the truth was, I was scared of what speaking up would cost me. Did you eventually report it? Eventually. It took me longer than it should have. He pushed the food around on his plate. By the time I said something, the problems were bigger and harder to fix, and I'd lost the moral high ground that I would have had if I'd moved faster. Ava was watching him carefully. What happened? I left. The company restructured, some people lost their jobs, and I went somewhere else and started building a cleaner record. And the manager? Got quietly reassigned. Nowhere near enough accountability. She sat back. How old were you? 24? 25? That's young to be in that situation. Young enough to handle it badly, yeah. There was something in the way she was looking at him, not judgment, something more like careful attention, that made Logan want to say more. The words were actually right there. The Derek situation, the HR meetings, the emails he'd never written sitting in Patricia's file. He felt the shape of it in his mouth. And then Ava's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and made a small, controlled expression that he'd come to recognize as the look she made when something work-related required immediate management. I'm sorry, she said. Give me 30 seconds. Take your time. She typed a response quickly, set the phone face down. Board member, she said, by way of explanation, and rolled her eyes slightly. Carl has decided this week is a good week to raise concerns about the Q4 projections. Specifically in writing, specifically at 8:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Classic move. He's nothing if not consistent. She exhaled. Sorry. Where were we? The moment had closed. Logan felt it close, the specific click of a window that had been briefly open, and heard himself say, I was just saying that it took me a while to learn how to speak up earlier in difficult situations. That's a lesson most people learn the same way, she said. Too late. Yeah. And the conversation moved on, and he told himself he'd find another moment, and the Thai food was good, and the walk back to their cars was comfortable and easy, and she kissed him at the corner under a streetlight, and he held on to that for a moment longer than was strictly casual, and it was not until he was driving home that he understood he'd let the opening pass. Cool. Derek Solis sat 2 rows ahead of Logan in the Wednesday all-hands meeting and spent 40 minutes being articulate and collegial and impressive, the way he always was in rooms with senior people watching. He had a gift for performing competence in ways that read as effortless, and Logan had spent enough time in adjacent positions to know how much effort actually went into the performance. After the meeting broke, Derek stopped Logan in the hallway with the easy manner of someone who had nothing to hide. Hey, good presentation from your team on the Garfield timeline. Solid numbers. Logan looked at him. Thanks. How's the HR thing treating you? I heard there was some kind of review. He said it casually, with the calibrated neutrality of someone who'd practiced the delivery. Logan kept his voice even. Where'd you hear that? Derek shrugged. Things get around. You know how this place is? He tilted his head slightly. If you need anyone to put in a word, speak to your track record, or whatever. I'm happy to, for what it's worth. It was an extraordinary thing to say. Either Derek was genuinely unconnected to the allegations and offering help, or he was sitting across the table from the man he'd been quietly dismantling and offering help for his own entertainment. Logan looked at him for a second longer than was comfortable. I'm handling it, Logan said. Sure. Derek clapped him once on the shoulder in that way that was friendly and territorial at exactly the same time. Just keep me in mind. He walked away down the hall, and Logan stood there and felt something quiet and cold settle into his chest. Not panic, not anger, just the recognition of how much trouble he might actually be in. He told Marcus on Thursday. Not all of it, most of it. They were at Marcus's kitchen table with 2 beers and the particular ease of a friendship that had enough history to handle honesty, and Logan laid out the Derek situation, the pattern of it, the HR complaint, the fabricated emails, in the same flat tone he used for everything difficult. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Marcus. When Logan finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has this been going on?" "The campaign against me? Maybe 18 months? The formal complaint, about 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Marcus set his beer down carefully. "Logan, I know. 3 weeks, and you didn't say anything. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with first." "You wanted to manage it alone first," Marcus said, "which is different from understanding it." He rubbed his face. "Does Ava know?" "No." Marcus looked at the ceiling. "Okay. Don't say it." "I'm not saying anything." "You're doing the face." "I don't have a face. You have a very specific face you make when I'm being an idiot about something and you're deciding whether to tell me." Marcus looked at him. "You're being an idiot about this. Because I'm handling my own problems? Because you're building something with someone and you're leaving out the parts that are on fire." Marcus picked his beer back up. "She's going to find out, Logan, either from you or from somewhere else. And the somewhere else version is worse. The somewhere else version requires someone to tell her. You're assuming this stays contained, but you just told me that whoever did this knows how you write, knows your professional history well enough to fabricate credible documentation." Marcus let that sit. "That's not someone who's going to stop at an internal HR review." Logan hadn't thought it through quite that far. Or he had, somewhere at the edge of his awareness, and had chosen not to follow the thought to its conclusion. "I'll handle it," he said. Marcus gave him a long, level look. "That's what you always say." "It's always been true." "Has it?" Marcus said quietly. "Or have you just been handling things alone for so long that you've forgotten what actually getting help looks like?" Logan didn't answer. He picked at the label on his beer bottle and looked at the kitchen table and thought about Sophie telling him the truth was the fastest way to fix things, and thought about the documentary CFO choosing the comfortable interpretation, and thought about Ava saying the mechanics of being afraid and making the wrong call because of it. He sat with all of that and still didn't know how to pick up the phone. 3 weeks later, in the last week of November, Logan finally introduced Sophie to Ava. Not formally, nothing engineered. Ava had mentioned she was picking up pastries from a bakery near Logan's neighborhood on a Saturday morning, and Logan had said they'd probably be at the park around that time if she wanted to walk over, and she'd said she might. And sure enough, at 11:15 she appeared at the edge of the park with a brown paper bag and found them exactly where Logan had said they'd be. Sophie spotted her first. "Is that her?" Sophie asked, in the direct whisper of a child who doesn't fully understand the volume range of whispering. "That's her." Sophie examined Ava for approximately 4 seconds. "She's tall." "Yes." "She looks like she makes decisions." Logan turned and looked at his daughter. "Where do you get these things?" "She just does." Ava reached them and crouched down slightly to Sophie's level, not in the exaggerated way some adults did with children, bending too far and using a different voice, but just enough to make the geography easier. "You must be Sophie. I've heard things about you." "What kind of things?" Sophie asked. "That you have opinions about music at dinner." Sophie's eyes moved sideways to Logan for half a second and then back to Ava. "Acoustic guitar is better with grilled cheese. It's not an opinion, it's just true." "I tend to agree," Ava said seriously. "I'd argue the same for soup." Sophie considered this with visible interest. "What about pasta?" "Depends on the pasta. Something with red sauce I think needs something with a little edge. But a cream sauce, I could see acoustic." Sophie nodded like this was a reasonable position. "Do you want to see the climbing structure? I found a part on the back that most people don't know about. Ava looked up at Logan briefly. He gave her nothing, just watched with his arms crossed and the specific private pleasure of a man watching two people he cared about navigate each other. "Lead the way," Ava said. He watched them walk toward the climbing structure, Sophie immediately talking with both hands the way she did when she was interested in something. Ava listening with what looked from this distance like genuine attention. Not performed. Not the particular patience adults sometimes stretched across interactions with children they didn't actually know what to do with. Just present. He sat on the bench with his coffee and felt something in his chest that was complicated and warm and slightly terrifying. They ate the pastries on the bench afterward, Sophie consuming hers in 4 bites, while Logan and Ava still had most of theirs, and somewhere in the middle of it, Sophie asked Ava what she did for work. "I run a company," Ava said. "What kind?" "Investment. We help people figure out where to put their money." Sophie processed this. "Is that why you look like you make decisions?" Ava's mouth twitched. "Probably part of it. My dad makes decisions too, but he hides it more." Sophie looked at Logan. "He has the face, but he tries not to show it." "I'm sitting right here," Logan said. "I know." She returned her attention to Ava. "Do you get to be the boss?" "I am the boss, yes." "I want to be the boss of something," Sophie said. "I haven't decided what yet." "You've got time," Ava said. "What are you interested in right now?" "Architecture," Sophie said, which surprised Logan slightly because she'd been saying marine biology for the last 2 months. "I like how buildings make you feel different things depending on how they're shaped." Ava looked genuinely surprised, and then genuinely impressed. "That's a really sophisticated observation." "What does sophisticated mean?" "It means you notice something most adults don't think about." Sophie considered this. "Is it like perceptive?" "Similar, yes." "Mrs. Park says I'm perceptive." She dusted pastry flakes off her jacket. "I'm going to go back to the climbing thing." And she was gone. Just like that, the way children evacuated conversations the moment they'd gotten what they needed from them. Logan watched her go and then looked at Ava, who was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Softer, somehow, around the edges. "She's incredible," Ava said. "I know." "You didn't tell me about the architecture thing." "I didn't know about it until 30 seconds ago." Ava laughed. The genuine one, the short burst of it she couldn't always suppress. "She's going to be a handful." "She already is." He finished his coffee. "She liked you." "How can you tell?" "She showed you the secret part of the climbing structure. She doesn't do that with everyone." Ava looked down at the paper bag in her hands. A beat passed. Then she said quietly, "I like her too." And Logan sat with that, the warmth of it, and also the low-grade awareness of the thing he still hadn't said, still circling the conversation he kept almost having and then steering away from. The HR process had moved to a second review stage. Patricia had told him on Friday that the allegations had been formally documented, which meant they were no longer preliminary, which meant they were real in the way that official things became real once they had a file number attached to them. He'd told himself there'd be a right moment, but the moments kept arriving and he kept managing them into something other than honesty. And somewhere in the back of his awareness, he understood, even if he wouldn't fully say it yet, that he was building the wrong thing. Not with Ava. Everything with Ava felt like the realest thing he'd touched in years. But he was building on a foundation that had a crack running through it, and he kept pouring more into it without addressing the crack. And at some point, the weight of everything good was going to make the crack worse instead of better. He just hadn't hit that point yet. He watched Sophie hang upside down from the climbing structure and call something triumphant across the park, and Ava shook her head slightly beside him and said, "Definitely a handful." And he laughed, and the morning continued, clear and cold and good. It was Marcus who finally said it bluntly, 2 weeks before everything broke open. They were talking on the phone. Marcus in his car outside a grocery store, Logan in his apartment after Sophie had gone to bed. And Marcus had been filling him in on something inconsequential when he just stopped mid-sentence. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it this time." Logan shifted on the couch. "Okay. This thing with Derek and the HR stuff, it's been going on for months. You've been telling yourself it's contained, but someone put that much work into building a case against you, and you still haven't told Ava. Marcus wasn't being cruel. His voice had the flat directness of someone who'd decided that kindness in this specific instance was not the useful tool. You're setting her up to find out from somewhere else. And when she does, and Logan, when she does, she's not going to be upset because of the Derek thing. She's going to be upset because you didn't tell her. You had months and you didn't tell her. Logan was quiet. I know you think you're protecting her, Marcus said. I know that's the story you're telling yourself. But there's another version of this, and I think you know what it is. Say it. You're not protecting her, you're protecting yourself. Because if you tell her and she still leaves, that's worse than her leaving because of something she found out on her own. At least if she leaves on her own, it wasn't the telling that broke it. Marcus let that settle. But if you don't tell her and she finds out from somewhere else, you don't get to be surprised. You made that outcome possible. Long silence. You're probably right, Logan said, which was not something he said easily. I'm definitely right. No gloating in it, just tired certainty. Talk to her, Logan, not a version of it, not the cleaned up draft. Just tell her what's happening. He said he would. He told himself he'd find the moment that week. He was 3 days too late. The call came on a Tuesday morning, which was the kind of mundane detail that made the whole thing feel worse somehow. Not a dramatic Friday afternoon, not even a Monday with its built-in sense of consequence. Just an ordinary Tuesday when Logan was between meetings with a cup of coffee he hadn't finished, and his calendar showing a 2 o'clock site visit he'd been looking forward to. Patricia from HR asked him to come in at 11. He knew from her voice, not what specifically, but the shape of it, the particular controlled neutrality that HR people used when they were delivering something that had already been decided. He'd heard that voice once before in his career, at the job he'd left in his mid-20s, and his body recognized it before his brain fully processed the words. He was in her office at 10:58. She had a folder on her desk, a real one, physical, the kind that suggested the paperwork had reached a stage beyond digital. Sitting beside her was a man Logan didn't recognize. Mid-50s, gray suit, the particular stillness of someone whose entire function in the room was to be a witness. This is Robert Chen from Legal, Patricia said. He's here as part of the formal review process. Logan sat down. He kept his hands flat on his knees. What followed was 22 minutes of careful legalistic language that translated, stripped to its core, to this. The allegations against him had been formally escalated. The documentation submitted, the emails, the statements, the incident reports, had been reviewed by both HR and an external compliance consultant. Pending a full internal investigation, Logan was being placed on administrative leave. Paid. Temporary. Pending outcome. He was not to access company systems. He was not to contact colleagues about matters related to the review. He would return his building badge and his company laptop before leaving the building today. We want to be clear, Patricia said, that this is a procedural step, not a determination of guilt. Logan looked at her. You have emails you're treating as genuine that I didn't write. The investigation will address questions of authenticity. How long does that take? These processes typically take 4 to 6 weeks. He nodded once. He was doing the thing he'd learned to do in difficult rooms, which was to keep his face very still and let his body be present while the part of him that actually felt things retreated somewhere internal to process later. Is there anything else? He asked. There was not. He walked out of Patricia's office with his building badge in his pocket for the last time and collected his personal items from his desk, a framed photo of Sophie, a coffee mug she'd painted for him in first grade with uneven letters spelling Dad in 4 different colors, and walked through the lobby past the front desk and out through the glass doors into the cold December air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he called his lawyer. Dusk. Claire Maddox had been a labor and employment attorney for 19 years and had the manner of someone who'd heard everything at least twice and had stopped being shocked by any of it. Logan had used her 3 years ago for a contract dispute that turned out to be minor, and he'd kept her number because he had the instinct of a man who'd learned that having certain numbers was better than needing them and not having them. He explained the situation in the parking garage of the building next door, sitting in his car with the engine off. She listened without interrupting. "Digital forensics," she said when he finished. "That's step one. If those emails were fabricated, there'll be metadata that doesn't match. File creation timestamps, server routing logs, sender authentication headers. Whoever did this was sophisticated enough to make the content convincing, but content is the easy part. The technical trail is harder to fake. How long to get that analysis? Depends on what the company will share. If they're cooperative, 2 weeks. If we need to compel it, longer." She paused. "You said you think you know who's behind this." "I think so. I don't have proof." "Tell me everything you have, even if it seems circumstantial. Sometimes circumstantial builds a picture." He told her about Derek. 2 years of pattern, the redirected opportunities, the misattributed work, the complaint that had started this process, the hallway conversation where Derek had offered help with the ease of someone who knew exactly what help was needed and why. Claire took notes he could hear but couldn't see. "Have you told the woman you're seeing about any of this?" Claire asked. Logan was briefly caught off guard by the shift. No, not fully." "You should," she said, not unkindly. "Not for legal reasons. Just because if this gets messier, and it might, she's going to hear things. Better that she hears your version first, with context." He said he understood. He thanked her. She said she'd call him by end of week. He sat in the parking garage for another 10 minutes after he hung up, watching a pigeon navigate the concrete ceiling, and then he drove to pick Sophie up from school 3 hours early without telling her why. And when she came out and saw him standing by the car at the wrong time, she went still for a second the way kids did when they sensed adult wrongness. "What happened?" she asked. "I got some unexpected time off," he said. Sophie looked at him. She had her backpack on both shoulders and her coat halfway unzipped, and the painted-on skepticism of a child who was old enough to know when adults were softening things. "Is it the bad situation at work?" "Yeah." She climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in without saying anything else. After a minute, she said, "Are you going to be okay?" "Yeah, bud. I'm going to be okay." She looked out the window. "Do you want to make soup when we get home? Soup helps." He kept his eyes on the road. "Soup sounds good." Try it. He called Ava that night after Sophie was in bed. Not in person. He'd thought about going to her, but something in him needed the distance the phone created. Not to hide behind, but because the thing he had to say felt like it would be easier to say without her face in front of him. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of seeing there. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, I need to tell you something," he said. A beat of silence. The shift in his voice had been enough. "Okay," she said, and the lightness went out of her tone. He told her. The real version. Not the cleaned-up draft Marcus had warned him against. He started at the beginning. Derek Solis, the 18 months of quiet professional sabotage, the HR complaint, the fabricated emails. Then further back, the thing he'd alluded to at dinner after the documentary, the job in his mid-20s, the manager he hadn't reported fast enough. He told her that someone had used his professional history, those real missteps, that real context, as scaffolding to make the fabricated allegations look more plausible. He told her he'd known about the formal review for weeks and hadn't told her. When he finished, the silence on her end was different from her usual silences. Her usual silences were thinking silences. This one had a different quality, tighter, like something was being held. "How long ago did they put you on leave?" she asked. "This morning. And the formal HR review started 3 weeks ago." Another silence. Longer. "Logan." Her voice was controlled. Not cold, but controlled, which with Ava was sometimes its own kind of temperature. "We've seen each other 4 times in the last 3 weeks." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" He'd prepared for this question. He'd run the answer through his head 6 different ways. And when the moment arrived, all the prepared versions felt like exactly what Marcus had warned him against. The cleaned-up draft, the version that made him look thoughtful instead of afraid. "Because I was scared," he said. "Not of losing the job. I was scared of losing this. And I told myself I was protecting you from a problem that might resolve itself. But that wasn't really it. I was protecting myself from having to find out whether this was something you'd stay for. Silence. That's the honest answer, he said. Ava exhaled. He heard it. I appreciate you telling me, she said carefully. I need some time to sit with this. Okay? I'm not angry about the Derek situation. That's not yours to have controlled. A pause. I'm angry about the 3 weeks. I know. Because She stopped, started again. I've been telling myself that this was different, that you were someone I didn't have to decode, and finding out that there were things you were actively managing away from me, that's a specific kind of thing to find out. I know, he said again, because it was true and anything else felt like an attempt to argue against her having a legitimate reaction. Let me think, she said. Okay, I'll call you. She hung up, and the apartment was very quiet, and Logan sat with his phone in his hand and the particular awareness of a man who had just told the truth too late and was now in the waiting room of the consequences. She didn't call the next day, or the day after. On the 3rd day, she texted, I'm not disappearing. I just need a few days. I'll reach out when I'm ready. He texted back, take the time you need. And meant it, even though meaning it was one of the harder things he'd done that week. The leave from work had a disorienting texture he hadn't anticipated. He was used to structure, early mornings, site visits, team meetings, the steady machinery of a demanding job. Without it, the days had a shapelessness that was fine for Sophie, but uncomfortable for him. He was not built for stillness. He cleaned the apartment with the focus of someone who needed to do something with his hands. He reorganized the kitchen cabinets for the 2nd time in 2 years. He read 3 chapters of a book and retained none of them. He also, with Claire's guidance, began building his defense. Claire had submitted a formal request for the technical metadata on the disputed emails. She'd advised him to document every professional interaction he'd had with Derek over the past 2 years. Anything saved, anything witnessed, anything that could establish pattern. Logan spent 2 days on this, going through his own email archives, his project notes, his calendar records, assembling the geography of what had actually happened across 18 months, in the kind of methodical detail that was both useful and painful. It was painful because doing it made the shape of Derek's campaign visible in a way it hadn't been when Logan was inside it. He'd known it was happening. He'd felt the friction of it. But seeing it mapped out, the timing, the escalation, the patience of it, landed differently. This had been planned, over a long time and with a specific intent, not impulsive, not reactive. Someone had decided, at some point, that Logan Hayes needed to be dismantled, and had set about doing it with a deliberateness that was genuinely unsettling. He thought again about the conversation in the hallway, Derek offering to put in a word, the specific theater of it. He thought about the thing Claire had said, that someone had used his real history as scaffolding. His actual past, the real failures and the real missteps, had been wrapped around the fabrications to make everything harder to dispute. Because if you went to a compliance consultant and said, this man has a documented history of workplace issues and here are the emails to prove it, and the emails were convincing, the real history made the fabricated part more believable. Whoever had done this knew his real history, knew it well enough to weaponize it. That thought sat uneasily in Logan's chest as he went through his records, and he followed it carefully, and it led him somewhere he hadn't expected. Because the specific incidents in his past that had been referenced, the things that gave the fabrications their plausibility, weren't things he'd widely discussed. The situation at his old company, the manager, the delayed report. He'd mentioned it to very few people over the years. Marcus knew. Claire now knew because he'd told her. And there was one other person, someone from that time, a woman named Rachel Voss who'd been a colleague at the old company during that period, and who had, in the years since, maintained a peripheral presence in his professional orbit, a LinkedIn connection, occasional overlapping conference attendance. 2 years ago, a brief and uncomfortable attempt to reestablish personal contact that Logan had declined quietly. He thought about Rachel Voss for a long time. He called Claire. Meanwhile, across the city, in the 14th floor apartment with the doorman who nodded without speaking, Ava Kensington was doing what she always did when she had a problem that resisted easy resolution. She took it apart. She'd cleared her Thursday evening and sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water she'd forgotten to drink and thought about Logan Hayes with the same structured attention she brought to any serious analysis. Not cold. She wasn't capable of being cold about this, which was itself information, but systematic. She thought about what he'd told her. She thought about the things he hadn't told her and when, and the decisions behind the not telling. She thought about the documentary and the CFO and Logan's very specific articulation of the mechanics of being afraid and making the wrong call. She hadn't registered it at the time, but she registered it now. He'd been describing himself, obliquely, imperfectly, in the only language he apparently had for it in that moment. He'd been trying to say it and not quite getting there. She picked up her phone and opened their text thread and read back through it. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was looking at it with the particular attention she gave to financial documents when something felt off. Not trying to confirm a suspicion, just reading carefully without an agenda. What she found, or rather what she noticed, was this. He was present in every message. Not performatively present, not the effortful engagement of someone who was managing an impression. His texts were short, often, but they were specific to her. He remembered things she'd said. He followed up on things. He asked about Carl Weiss's board campaign after she'd mentioned it once in passing. He asked how the Northern District expansion vote had gone. He'd been paying attention. That didn't fix the 3 weeks. She wasn't going to let herself be talked out of being bothered by the 3 weeks because she was bothered by it and she had a right to be. But she sat with the fuller picture, and the fuller picture was not simple, and Ava had built a career on resisting the pull towards simple interpretations of complicated situations. She thought about her last relationship, the man who smoothed everything over, who made every difficulty disappear before it could be examined. She'd described that to Logan on their 3rd or 4th meeting and called it exhausting. She'd said it felt like all the furniture was nailed down. She'd meant it. Logan was the opposite of nailed down furniture. He was, in fact, a man who was carrying things he hadn't yet figured out how to put down in front of someone else. That was not a character virtue exactly. It was a problem, and it had created real damage. But it was also not the same thing as dishonesty. It was closer to fear, which she understood because fear was something she had a personal relationship with, even if hers expressed itself differently. She sat with all of this until the glass of water was still full and the city outside had gone fully dark. Then she picked up her phone. Logan was in Sophie's doorway watching her sleep the way parents did. The particular checking that was really just looking, not out of worry, but out of something that didn't have a clean name. When his phone buzzed, he stepped into the hallway and looked at the screen. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." He typed back, "Ask." 3 minutes passed, then, "Is there anything else you haven't told me? About the work situation, about your past, about anything that's relevant to what's happening, anything at all?" He stood in the hallway in the dark and thought about Rachel Voss, whose name had been sitting in the back of his mind for 3 days like a stone he hadn't yet picked up. He thought about Claire's theory, still unconfirmed, still just the geometry of the thing. He thought about Marcus telling him that the somewhere else version was worse. He typed, "There might be someone from my past involved in this. A former colleague. I'm not certain yet. My lawyer is looking into it. I should have mentioned it when I called you. I was still processing what it meant." Ava's response took 4 minutes. "Okay. That's the kind of thing you tell me when you're not certain too. That's how this works." He read that twice. "I'm learning that." Another pause. Then, "I'm not done being frustrated with you. I know, but I also don't think you're a dishonest person. I think you're a person who learned to handle things alone and hasn't fully unlearned it yet." He leaned against the wall in the dark hallway of his apartment and read that 3 times. "That's a generous read," he typed. "It's an accurate one." A pause. "Get some rest, Logan. We'll talk properly soon." He put his phone in his pocket and stood in the hallway for another moment. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep. Not distressed, just the ordinary sounds of a child deep in dreams. And he let that settle around him like something he was grateful for. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. But something had shifted just slightly, and he held on to that the way you held on to the edge of something when you weren't sure yet whether you were climbing or hanging on. 3 days later, Claire Maddox called him with the first piece of real evidence. The metadata on 2 of the fabricated emails didn't match. The file creation timestamps predated the dates shown in the email headers by 11 days. Someone had built the documents first and backdated them, and had not been careful enough about how they'd done it. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was the first crack of daylight in a very long tunnel, and Logan Hayes sitting at his kitchen table with Sophie eating cereal across from him, and the winter morning coming in gray through the window, felt something loosen just slightly in his chest. "You're smiling," Sophie said. "A little?" She pointed her spoon at him. "Is it good news?" "Early good news?" he said. "We'll see." She considered this and returned to her cereal, apparently satisfied. Outside, the city continued without particular interest in any of it, and Logan drank his coffee and sat with the small, careful fact of a crack in the wall and allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to think about what might be on the other side of it. The metadata discrepancy was real, but it wasn't enough on its own. Claire explained this to Logan on a Thursday morning with the patient precision of someone who'd learned not to let clients build too much on partial wins. The timestamps proved the documents had been created before the dates they displayed. What they didn't prove, not yet, was who had created them. Digital forensics could establish that the files were fabricated. Establishing who had done the fabricating required something more: access records, device trails, a connection between the forgeries and a specific person that a formal hearing would accept as evidence rather than inference. "We need Rachel Voss," Claire said. Logan had given her everything he had on Rachel 3 days earlier: the old company, the overlap in years, the nature of their professional relationship, the attempt at personal contact 2 years ago that he'd deflected. Claire had done her own research in the days since, and what she'd found had added texture to the picture that Logan hadn't had. "Rachel Voss left the company you worked at 8 months after you did," Claire said. "She's been in independent consulting since then, which means she has flexible access and no single employer monitoring her activity. She's attended 3 of the same industry events as Derek Solis in the last 18 months. 2 of those overlaps happened after the HR complaint against you was first filed." Logan was quiet. "That's not proof either," Claire said, "but it's a connection, and it gives us a thread worth pulling." "How do you pull it?" "We request the communications logs from the company's external email server as part of discovery. If Rachel and Derek were coordinating, there's a reasonable chance some of that communication passed through channels that left a record. People who think they're being careful often aren't careful about everything." "And if they were careful about everything?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "Then we look for what they couldn't control. Someone who builds this kind of case, documents, statements, coordinated testimony, has to trust the people they're working with. Trust creates exposure. We look for the places where the coordination had to happen in person, or through intermediaries who might not be as committed to the silence." It was not a reassuring conversation. It was, however, an honest one, and Logan had developed a new appreciation for honest conversations in recent weeks, even when they weren't the conversations he'd have chosen. Ava came to him on a Saturday. Not at his invitation. She texted at 9 in the morning and said she was bringing coffee and that she'd be there at 10, framed as a statement rather than a question, which was so characteristically her that something in him loosened at the sight of it. He told Sophie they were having company. Sophie looked up from the elaborate architectural drawing she'd been working on for 3 days, a building she'd designed herself, with specific attention to the way the windows would catch afternoon light, and said, "Is it Ava?" "Yes." Sophie returned to her drawing. "Good. I have a question about load-bearing walls." When Ava arrived, she had 2 coffees and a bag of pastries from the same bakery as the park morning, and she and Logan stood in his kitchen for a moment in the particular careful way of 2 people who had said real things to each other through a phone and were now renegotiating what that meant in physical proximity. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She looked at him, direct, assessing, the way she looked at things she was deciding how to feel about. Then she set the coffees on the counter and reached out and briefly touched his forearm, just once, and that was all. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway with her architectural drawing. "Ava, if a building has an open floor plan on the 3rd level, does it need additional support columns, or can the 2nd floor beams carry the load?" Ava blinked. Then she looked at Logan, who gave her nothing, and back at Sophie. "That depends on the span and the material. What are you working with?" "I haven't decided yet. I was thinking steel." Steel gives you more flexibility. Show me what you've got. They sat at the kitchen table, Sophie's drawing spread between them. And Ava asked questions and Sophie answered with the confidence of someone who'd been thinking about this for weeks. And Logan stood with his coffee and watched them and thought about the word undeserved, which was not a word he let himself use often, but which arrived anyway, quietly, without being invited. He told her the rest of it after Sophie had gone to a neighbor's for the afternoon. They sat on his couch with the gray January light coming through the windows, and Logan told her about Rachel Voss, the full version, not the abbreviated one he'd given over text, the history, the declined contact, what Claire had found about the professional overlap with Derek. Ava listened without interrupting. This was one of the things about her he'd come to rely on. She didn't jump in, didn't reassure reflexively, didn't redirect to her own experiences. She just took in what you gave her. So it's possible, she said when he finished, that someone who had access to your real history from your early career connected with someone who had current motive and resources, and they built this together. That's the working theory. What does your lawyer think the odds are? She doesn't deal in odds, but she thinks the threat is real. Ava was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in both hands. Can I ask you something about Rachel? Yeah. When she reached out 2 years ago, the personal contact you declined, what was that like? He thought about how to answer that without being reductive. It was uncomfortable. We hadn't had a bad relationship exactly, but it was complicated. At the old company during the period I told you about, we were close for a while. When I left quickly, and I didn't handle that transition well with everyone, including her. Did she tell you she was angry? No. That was what made it uncomfortable. She was perfectly pleasant, wanted to reconnect, catch up, maybe grab lunch. He paused. It felt like something with no surface edge, but something underneath I couldn't see. So you stepped back. I stepped back. Ava nodded slowly. People who don't show the edge are sometimes the ones you need to worry about. Yeah, I know that now. She looked at him. You knew it then too. That's why you stepped back. Knowing something and knowing what to do with it are different. True. She set her coffee down. Logan, I need to say something and I need you to hear all of it without interrupting. Okay? I was angry, she said. About the 3 weeks. About the fact that you were sitting across from me and choosing what to tell me and what to manage. I want you to understand that the anger was real and it was legitimate and it's not gone. I know. But she turned toward him slightly. I've also been thinking about what you actually did. Not the 3 weeks. I mean, since this started. You hired a lawyer immediately. You've been building a defense, not sitting around hoping it goes away. You've been honest with me since you told me, even when the honest answer was uncomfortable. She paused. You're not someone who does nothing when things get hard. You're someone who does things alone when things get hard. That's a different problem. It's still a problem. It is, she agreed, but it's a workable one. She held his gaze. I need you to tell me things when they're happening, Logan. Not when you've figured out how to handle them. When they're happening. Can you actually do that? He sat with the question. He didn't give her the fast answer, which would have been yes without the weight behind it. He thought about the pattern, the years of it, the grooves it had worn. And he thought about whether he was actually capable of changing it or whether he was just someone who wanted to want to change it. I don't know if I can do it perfectly, he said, but I can do it better than I have been, and I can keep doing it better. Ava looked at him for a long moment. That's a more honest answer than yes. I figured. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatic, just the particular easing that happened when 2 people had said the real thing and were now on the other side of it. Okay, she said. Then we figure this out together. He looked at her. You don't have to be involved in this. I know. Her voice was even. I'm choosing to be. What Ava didn't tell Logan in that conversation, because she was still turning it over, still deciding what it meant, was that she'd already started looking. It had begun 3 days after his phone call, when the CEO in her had overridden the personal hurt and started asking the question she always asked in situations that didn't add up. Where are the inconsistencies? She'd requested, through a contact at a professional background verification firm, she occasionally used for executive hires, a quiet inquiry into the documents Logan had described. She hadn't told him because she hadn't known yet what she'd find, and she didn't want to offer him something that turned out to be nothing. She'd sat with this for a week before she understood that she was doing the same thing she was angry at him for, managing information instead of sharing it, and that had been, in its own way, clarifying. What the inquiry had returned was limited but interesting. The compliance consultant hired by Logan's company to review the allegations was a firm called Verimark Advisory. Verimark Advisory had done consulting work for 2 other companies in the same industry over the past 3 years. One of those companies had, in its executive team, a former colleague of Derek Solis from before his current position. It was thin, she knew it was thin, but Ava Kensington had built 4 years of business decisions on the ability to see the shape of a thing before all its parts were visible, and the shape of this one looked familiar. It looked like something coordinated, something that had used institutional channels because the people behind it knew how institutional channels worked and how to make them do what you wanted if you understood their mechanics. She passed this to Claire Maddox through Logan, who called her that evening after Ava had gone home, and Claire was quiet for a long moment before saying, "That's useful. That's actually very useful." "She found it herself," Logan said. "I didn't ask her to." "I know," Claire said. "It's better that way. It's cleaner." The formal hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of February. In the 4 weeks between Ava's Saturday visit and that date, several things happened in the particular overlapping, non-linear way that real situations developed, nothing arriving in the clean sequence of a story that knew where it was going. Claire's discovery request produced communication logs that showed 11 email exchanges between a personal account traced to Rachel Voss and an account registered to a Shell Consulting profile that digital forensics subsequently linked to a device registered at Derek Solis's home address. The exchanges had been routed through 2 intermediary servers in an attempt at obfuscation that was careful enough to slow the trail, but not careful enough to eliminate it. This was the thing that Claire had predicted. That people who trusted each other to stay silent weren't always equally careful about the technical side. The content of the emails was damning. Not explicit, Rachel and Derek were not the kind of people who wrote, "Here is the plan to destroy Logan Hayes" in a subject line, but specific enough that the pattern was readable. References to documents, to timing, to the compliance consultant, to the particular HR pathway that would produce the most institutional weight with the least immediate visibility. Logan read the summary Claire sent him and sat with it for a long time. He'd suspected Derek for months, but Rachel was older, further back, more surprising in the way that things from the past were always more surprising than the threats in front of you. He thought about the woman he'd known at 25, someone he'd genuinely liked in the ordinary way of colleagues who shared difficult circumstances, and tried to locate the bridge between that person and this one. He couldn't find it cleanly. People were not always the same people you'd known them to be, and the years between could do things you couldn't see from the outside. He called Marcus. "They found the connection," he said. Marcus was quiet for a second, then, Okay, good. Rachel and Derek, there's documented communication. How solid?" "Solid enough for the hearing. Claire thinks it's solid enough." Marcus exhaled. "How are you feeling?" "I don't know yet." He was sitting at his kitchen table again, the place where he seemed to process everything. Sophie's architectural drawing still in the corner where she'd left it. "Relieved, maybe. A little. And also something else I can't name." "You thought you'd handled the Rachel situation by stepping back." "Yeah." "And instead stepping back just meant you weren't watching." "Yeah." He rubbed his face. "Marcus, I've been thinking about something." "What?" "I've spent a long time believing that the way to protect things was to keep problems separated. Keep the difficult stuff away from the good stuff. Keep Sophie away from the work problems. Keep the work problems away from Ava. Keep old history away from current life." He paused. "And what actually happened is that everything I kept separated found each other anyway. The old history connected to the current problem. The work problem got to Ava before I did. All the separating just meant I didn't see it coming." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Are you having an epiphany?" "I think I'm having a very slow, uncomfortable epiphany that I should have had about 5 years ago." "Better late," Marcus said. "Genuinely, Cheb." Ava attended the hearing. Logan hadn't asked her to. She hadn't announced she was coming. She texted at 8:15 in the morning, the hearing was at 10, and said, "I'll be outside. You don't have to do anything with that. Just wanted you to know." He'd read it in the car and sat with it for a full minute before he texted back, "Thank you." The hearing was held in a fourth-floor conference room at the company's legal counsel's office, not at the company itself, which was a procedural detail that communicated quietly that this had escalated past the level where the company wanted it on site. Present were Patricia and Robert Chen from the company, two attorneys from the company's external legal firm, Claire, a compliance officer from a neutral third-party firm, and a representative from the industry regulatory body that had become involved once the investigation expanded. Derek Solis was not in the room. He was represented by his own attorney, which told Logan something about how much Derek understood his own exposure at this point. Logan sat beside Claire and kept his hands flat on the table and said what he'd been asked to say, in the order he'd been asked to say it, without editorializing and without visible anger. Claire had prepared him for this specifically. "They don't need your emotions," she'd told him. "They need facts presented clearly. The documents will do the work. You just need to be credible." He was credible. He was, in fact, very good in this kind of room, not because he was comfortable, but because discomfort had never stopped him from being precise. The presentation took 40 minutes. The digital forensics report, the metadata analysis, the communication logs between Rachel and Derek, the connection to Verimark Advisory, and the conflict of interest in the company's choice of external reviewer. Ava's contribution, the Verimark thread, was presented through Claire as independently sourced information, which it was. When the compliance officer asked questions, Logan answered them. When the company's attorney pushed back on the interpretation of the metadata, Claire walked through the technical analysis point by point with the patience of someone who'd done this before and wasn't interested in being rushed. At 11:53, after nearly 2 hours, the regulatory body representative asked if there was anything further to present. There was not. The formal determination would be issued within 5 business days. Logan walked out of the building into the February cold and found Ava standing on the sidewalk with her coat collar up and her hands in her pockets. "How did it go?" she asked. "I think it went well." He exhaled. "I won't know for certain until the determination." She nodded. She didn't offer reassurances he'd have to calibrate, and he was grateful for that. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "Actually, yes. There's a diner 2 blocks from here, nothing fancy." "Perfect." They walked. The city was doing its ordinary mid-morning thing, delivery trucks, pedestrians, the particular gray brightness of a winter day that couldn't quite commit to weather. Logan's hands were cold. Ava's shoulder was close enough to his that they were almost touching, and after half a block her hand appeared from her coat pocket and found his, and she didn't make anything of it, just held on. He held back. The determination arrived on a Wednesday, 4 days later. Claire called him at 2 in the afternoon. "It's done," she said. "Full clearance. The allegations are formally determined to be fabricated. The company is retracting the administrative leave, expunging the HR record, and issuing a formal finding of misconduct against Derek Solis. The regulatory body is opening a separate professional conduct inquiry into both Solis and Voss." Logan was standing in the hallway of his apartment again, the same hallway where he'd listened to Patricia's voicemail what felt like a different year. "Okay," he said. "That's it? Okay?" "I mean," he stopped. "Thank you, Claire. Genuinely. I know what this took. You made it possible by building the record you did. And you're—" A pause. Ava Kensington's contribution was significant. The Verimark thread was the piece that established the integrity problem in the review process. Without that, the forensics alone might not have been enough to compel the regulatory review. He stood with that. "I'll tell her." "You should." A beat. "Logan, get some sleep. You've been running on adrenaline for 2 months. Let it land." He said he would. He hung up. He stood in the hallway and let it land. It was strange. He'd expected something bigger. A cleaner feeling, maybe. The dramatic exhale of a man who'd been holding his breath and finally hadn't needed to. What he felt instead was quieter and more complicated. Relief, yes, but underneath it an awareness of everything the last 2 months had cost and changed, and the understanding that being cleared was the end of one thing and not yet the beginning of whatever came next. He called Sophie out of her room. She appeared in her socks and her paint-stained sweatshirt and stood in the hallway looking at him with that direct assessment she'd inherited from some combination of genetics and pure self-determination. "The work thing," he said. "It's fixed." She examined his face. "For real fixed?" "For real fixed." She crossed the hallway and hugged him, not the wriggling 4-second hug she usually allowed, but a real one, with both arms and her face pressed against his side. And he put his hand on top of her head, and they stood there in the hallway for a while. "I knew it would be okay," she said, her voice muffled against his sweater. "Yeah? You always figure things out." He thought about the 8 weeks of it, the forensics and the hearing and the communication logs, and Ava finding the Verimark thread, and Claire's careful, relentless assembly of everything into something a formal process would accept. He thought about Marcus telling him he was an idiot. He thought about his own late, partial, imperfect honesty, and the cost it had almost levied. "I had a lot of help this time," he said. Sophie pulled back and looked up at him. "That's okay too," she said, as if this were obvious. "You're not supposed to do everything by yourself." He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, paint on her sweatshirt, absolutely certain, and thought that she had learned this lesson significantly faster than he had. "You're right," he said. "You're completely right." She looked satisfied and returned to her room, and Logan stood in the hallway and took out his phone and called Ava. She picked up on the second ring. "It's done," he said. "Full clearance." A silence. Then, quietly, "Good." Claire said the Verimark connection was significant, that it might have been the piece that made the regulatory review possible. "I had good information to work with." "Ava," he leaned against the wall, "you went looking on your own. You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Why did you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because something didn't add up, and I don't leave things alone when something doesn't add up." A pause. "And because you were worth looking." He didn't say anything for a second. The hallway was very quiet. Sophie's music had started up faintly from her room, something acoustic because it was nearly dinner time, and Sophie had rules about these things. "I have a lot I want to say to you," Logan said, "and I want to say it in person." "I know," Ava said. "I know you do." "Are you free tonight?" "Yes." "I'll come to you." "Okay." Another pause, smaller this time, just a breath. "Logan?" "Yeah." "I'm glad it's done." "Me too," he said. "Me too." He ended the call and stood in the hallway of his apartment with the acoustic guitar drifting faintly from Sophie's room, and the winter evening pressing against the windows. And he thought about everything that had broken in the last 2 months, and everything that had somehow held, and everything he still owed the honesty of saying out loud. He went to get his coat. He drove across the city with the heater running and the radio off. He'd turned the radio off somewhere around the 3rd intersection, not consciously, just the way you remove things when you needed to think without interference. The streets were doing their Wednesday evening thing, the tail end of rush hour, the particular density of a city winding down toward night, and Logan moved through it without impatience, which was unusual for him, because he was a man who was normally aware of time in the background of everything he did. Tonight he wasn't in a hurry, not because he didn't have things to say, but because he needed to get them right, and getting them right required arriving without the adrenaline of urgency. He'd spent enough of the last 2 months in crisis mode that his body had started treating urgency as the default state. He wanted to walk into Ava's apartment as something other than a man managing a situation. He found parking 2 blocks from her building and sat in the car for a minute. He thought about what he was going to say. Then he stopped trying to plan it, because planning it was the old habit. The idea that if he controlled the shape of the conversation, he could control the outcome. He'd spent 32 years believing that was wisdom. The last 2 months had made a reasonably thorough argument against it. He got out of the car and walked. Ava answered the door in a gray sweater and reading glasses she immediately took off, which was the first time he'd seen her in reading glasses, and which, for no logical reason, made him feel something specific and tender he didn't have a word for. Her apartment smelled like coffee. The city was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows spread out behind her in the particular nighttime geometry of downtown. Lit towers, moving traffic, the river catching light in the distance. "Hey," she said. "Hey." She stepped back to let him in. He'd been here twice before, but he still felt the dimensions of the place. Not its size exactly, but the quality of it. The way it was arranged by someone who thought carefully about space and what it did to the people inside it. Clean without being bare. Ordered without being controlled. She'd made tea. 2 cups, already on the coffee table, which meant she'd expected this to be a sitting conversation, and he appreciated that she'd already made the decision so he didn't have to navigate it. They sat. Not across from each other. She'd sat at one end of the couch and left the angle open rather than placing herself opposite him, which was the kind of thing she did that he'd learned to notice. She thought about geometry. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Strange," he said. "Like I've been holding something very heavy for a long time and someone just took it, but my arms are still in the position of holding it." She nodded. She knew what that was. It takes a while for the body to believe the thing is over. "Yeah." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I need to say some things." "I know. And I need you to let me get through them without stopping me, because if you respond too early, I'll lose the thread and start managing it." The corner of her mouth moved. "Okay." He took a breath. Not a performed breath, just the actual kind. The one you took when you were about to do something that required more of you than you'd planned to spend. "I have spent the majority of my adult life treating honesty as a thing I did in increments," he said, "where I'd give the accurate version of facts but leave out the parts I was afraid of. And I told myself that was being thoughtful, that I was waiting until I had more information, protecting the people I cared about from things they didn't need yet." He stopped. But what it actually was, what I actually was doing, was protecting myself from the specific risk of being fully known by someone and having that not be enough. Ava was very still. "Sophie's mother didn't leave because I wasn't enough," he said. "She left because she wanted a different life. I know that. But I made a decision after that, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that if I kept enough of myself back, if I kept the difficult parts managed and private, then what I offered would be easier to accept." He looked at her. "And the problem with that is that what you end up offering isn't you. It's a version of you with all the inconvenient parts removed. And if someone chooses that, you can't actually let them close, because you know they haven't actually seen what they're choosing." Ava didn't say anything, but her eyes hadn't moved from his face. "I kept the Derek situation from you because I was terrified," he said. "Not of losing the job. I've survived worse than losing a job. I was terrified of losing what we had before it was established enough to survive weight. And what I didn't understand, what took me 2 months of complete destruction to understand, is that keeping it from you didn't protect it. It just meant when everything broke, it broke alone. And alone is a much worse place to have things break than together." He stopped talking. The apartment was quiet. The city moved silently behind the glass. "I'm not finished," he said, "but I want to know if you want me to keep going." Ava looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving through her expression that he couldn't fully read. Not distance, not resistance, but something more internal, like she was putting things in order before she spoke. "Keep going," she said. "I love you," he said. I know the timing of that is not clean, and I know that sitting here on the other side of the worst 2 months of my adult life and saying that probably looks like someone who's had a scare and wants to hold on to something. But I have been carrying that around for a while, and I've been managing it the same way I managed everything else. And I'm done doing that. I love you, and Sophie loves you, and I would very much like to stop handling that alone too." The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and temperature and the specific quality of a silence that was not the absence of a response, but the presence of someone taking real time with a real thing. Ava set her tea down on the table. She looked at the window for a moment, at the city, and then she looked back at him. "When I ended my last relationship," she said slowly, "the thing I told myself was that I'd chosen wrong, that I'd picked someone because he was compatible on paper, because he moved in the right world, because he understood the surface of my life. And I promised myself the next time I'd be more careful." She paused. "What I didn't promise myself was that I'd actually be more open, because those are different things. Being careful and being open feel like opposites when you're afraid. He waited. I've been afraid too, she said. I didn't tell you that. I showed up and I asked you hard questions, and I spoke my mind, and I let you see me frustrated and uncertain, and I told myself that was openness. But there are things I didn't say. She turned her teacup in her hands. I didn't tell you how scared I was when you called that night. When you said I need to tell you something. I was scared not because I thought you were going to say something terrible, but because I realized in that specific moment that I cared enough that terrible was possible, that you had become someone who could actually hurt me. She looked at him. That's not a position I put myself in often. I've been very deliberate about not putting myself there. I know, he said, and I was angry at you. Genuinely, I was angry. But part of what I was angry about was that you'd already gotten that close without me fully deciding to let you. You'd just gotten there. And then you told me something difficult, and I had to figure out whether I was going to stay in that position or step back, and I didn't know how to do both at the same time. What did you decide? She looked at him steadily. I'm here, Logan. Yeah, he said. You are. I love you too, she said. Not dramatically, just plainly, the way she said things she'd already made her decision about. And I would like to stop being careful about that. Something in him that had been held at a particular tension for a very long time released, not with noise, just quietly, like a breath let out at the end of a long day. He reached across the couch and she met him halfway. And when he kissed her, it was different from the careful first kiss in the car and the streetlight kiss in February. It had more of both of them in it, the actual weight of the real people rather than the managed versions they'd each been partly offering. When they pulled back, she stayed close, her forehead almost against his temple. Sophie is going to be insufferable about this, she said. He laughed, the full version, unguarded. She already thinks she called it. She did call it. She really did, yeah. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. That was the thing that Logan would have said if anyone had asked him to describe what happened after the case closed and the formal determination was issued, and Derek Solis was placed on suspension pending the regulatory inquiry. It was not a transformation. His life did not reorganize itself into something unrecognizable. He was still the same person in the same apartment, with the same kid and the same stubborn habit of going quiet when things got hard. But there were differences. Smaller, more durable ones. He returned to work on a Monday in early March. Patricia met him in the lobby and shook his hand and said, in the careful language of HR, that the company was glad to have the matter resolved and looked forward to moving forward productively. He thanked her. He walked to his desk and unpacked the small box of things he'd taken home 2 months ago. The coffee mug Sophie had painted, the framed photo, and set them back where they'd been, and sat down and opened his email. His team sent him a group message that said simply, "Good to have you back, boss." 7 people had signed it. He read it 3 times before he could respond without his voice doing something he didn't want it to do. He took on 2 new projects in March, and 1 more in April. And he was good at his job. He'd always been good at his job, and the 2 months away had, if anything, clarified how much that mattered to him and why. Not for status, not for the salary, though the salary mattered with a daughter and a mortgage, but because he was good at looking at a complicated thing and figuring out how to build it. And there was a satisfaction in that which he'd stopped fully appreciating somewhere in the middle of surviving the Derek years. He had lunch with Marcus on a Thursday in March. Just lunch, nothing heavy scheduled, just a deli near Marcus's office, and 2 people who'd known each other long enough that they could sit in the regular kind of silence without it meaning anything. "You seem different," Marcus said, approximately halfway through a sandwich. "Different how?" Marcus considered. "Less like you're waiting for something bad to happen." Logan thought about that. "I'm probably still waiting. I'm just trying to be in the room while I wait." "That's progress." "It's something." Marcus pointed at him with a potato chip. "Are you going to thank me for setting up the blind date?" "Absolutely not. Danielle says she deserves equal credit. Neither of you deserve credit. You were trying to be funny and it accidentally worked out." Marcus grinned. "Those are the best plans." Derek Solis resigned from the company in March, before the regulatory inquiry concluded. Logan learned this from a colleague, not from any official source, in the offhand way that information about someone who'd been quietly removed moved through an organization, a mention in passing, a shrug, someone saying, yeah, he's gone with the particular flatness of people who'd already moved on. Logan sat with it for a day. He'd expected to feel something larger. Satisfaction, maybe? Or at least a concrete sense of resolution. What he felt was smaller and stranger than that. Not nothing, but not the thing he'd anticipated. Derek was gone, which was right. The system had, eventually, and with considerable pressure, worked the way it was supposed to work. The regulatory inquiry would do whatever the regulatory inquiry did, and Logan had decided that was no longer his to carry. He thought about Rachel Voss separately, because Rachel was different. She was the past in a way Derek wasn't, connected to a version of himself he'd never fully examined. Claire had told him that Rachel was cooperating with the regulatory inquiry in exchange for leniency on her own exposure, which meant the things she'd built with Derek had fractured exactly the way things built on shared vulnerability tended to fracture. He didn't feel angry at Rachel, which surprised him. He felt something more like tiredness, the kind that came from understanding, finally, that he'd left a wound unaddressed for a decade and someone had eventually found it and used it, and that the solution to that wasn't to be more careful about who saw it, but to actually address the wound. He'd left that job badly. He'd handled that chapter badly. He'd never quite made peace with it because making peace would have required sitting in the discomfort of it, and he'd preferred to keep moving. He booked 2 sessions with a therapist in April, not because he was in crisis, the crisis was over, but because he'd spent 2 months understanding that he had patterns he couldn't see clearly from inside them, and a person who spent their professional life helping other people see their blind spots seemed like a reasonable investment. He told Sophie he was going to talk to someone who helped people figure out the complicated stuff. Sophie said, like a feelings doctor? Sort of, yeah. Mrs. Park says everyone should have one of those. Mrs. Park is smart. I know, Sophie said. I've been saying that. 1. In April, Ava's Northern District expansion was approved by the board. Carl Weiss had voted against it, which surprised no one, but the other 2 votes he'd been quietly courting had not followed him, and the motion passed 4-2. Ava texted Logan from the board meeting room at 9:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. It passed. He was putting Sophie to bed when the text arrived. He read it and then looked at Sophie, who was in the middle of explaining a dream she'd had about a building that could talk, and he waited until she finished and tucked her in and went to the hallway. He called instead of texting back. Ava picked up on the first ring, which she almost never did. Congratulations, he said. She exhaled, long and real, the sound of genuine release. 4 months of Carl Weiss, and it's done in 20 minutes. How do you feel? Tired. Really, really tired. A pause. And good. Mostly good. Are you celebrating? I'm sitting in a parking garage eating a granola bar I found in my bag. He laughed. That's bleak. It's extremely bleak. The granola bar is also stale. Come over, he said. I'll make something. Sophie's asleep. It'll be quiet. But come over. A beat. It's almost 10. So? Another pause. Shorter. Give me 20 minutes. She arrived in 30, still in her work clothes, and he'd made eggs because eggs were the thing you made at 10 p.m. when you had good intentions and limited prep time, and they ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the rest of the apartment dark. And Ava told him about the board meeting in the real version. Not the polished recap she'd give in an interview, but the actual version, with the moment she'd been genuinely uncertain and the moment Carl Weiss had said something that had made her want to stand up, and the moment it had turned. He listened the way she'd listened to him, which was completely, without managing it toward anywhere. Carl's not going to stop, she said. Probably not. He's going to find the next thing. How are you going to handle it? She thought about it. Better than I handled this one. I spent too long trying to address it through back channels instead of directly. I kept thinking if I made the business case strong enough, the politics wouldn't matter. She ate the last of her eggs. Politics always matters. I know that. I just don't like it. Nobody likes it. Some people like it. Those people are exhausting. She smiled. The private one, the real one, the one that only arrived when she wasn't thinking about whether to show it. He'd cataloged that smile over 6 months and could distinguish it from the professional one the way you learn to distinguish sounds in a place you knew well. "Thank you for making eggs at 10 o'clock, she said. "Thank you for the granola bar visual. I needed to appreciate my life more." She threw a paper napkin at him. It was Sophie who first said it out loud, because Sophie had no patience for the unspoken, and she was also, as Logan had long suspected, several steps ahead of everyone around her. They were at the park on Callister Avenue in late April, the three of them, which had become a natural thing in the way that natural things arrived when nobody was making a point of them. And Sophie was on the climbing structure doing the thing on the back that most people didn't know about, while Logan and Ava sat on the bench with coffee. It was warm, the first real warmth of the year, the kind that felt specific and earned after a long winter, the kind that made you want to stay in it. Sophie descended from the climbing structure and walked over and stood in front of them with the directness of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. "Are you two going to be together for real?" she asked. Logan looked at her. "What do you mean, for real?" "Like, actually together, not just seeing each other." She tilted her head. "Because I want to know if I should stop being polite about having opinions, or if I should keep being polite." Ava made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "What opinions do you have?" "She likes the furniture arrangement better than yours," Logan said. Sophie pointed at him. "The couch should face the window. It's not complicated." "The couch faces the TV. The window is better." Ava was looking at Sophie with the particular expression she wore when she was genuinely charmed by something and had decided not to hide it. "I agree about the couch," she said. "For the record." Sophie looked satisfied. Then she looked at Logan. "So?" Logan looked at Ava. The park was warm around them, the climbing structure behind Sophie casting a short shadow in the April light. 6 months ago, he'd walked into a restaurant expecting nothing and made a calculation that he was too controlled to admit was a gamble. 2 months ago, he'd watched everything he'd been protecting collapse under the weight of the things he'd kept out of it. "Yeah," he said. "For real." Sophie nodded as if this had been obvious all along and turned back toward the climbing structure. "Good," she said over her shoulder. "Also the couch." Ava looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that didn't need words, which was its own kind of arrival. Two people who had gotten sufficiently real with each other that some things could live in the space between sentences. "The couch is fine where it is," he said. "I'm not going to agree with you about that." "I know." "And she's not going to drop it." "I know that too." She leaned slightly toward him, her shoulder against his, and they sat in the April warmth and watched Sophie navigate the structure with complete confidence, calling something down to them that neither of them caught. And it didn't matter, the tone was triumphant, which was enough. There was a conversation Logan had with his therapist in late April that he turned over for a long time afterward. They'd been talking about the pattern, the management habit, the controlled disclosure, the deep-running belief that keeping the difficult parts separate was a form of protection. His therapist, a practical woman named Dr. Yuen, who had an office that smelled like old books and a habit of letting long silences run without discomfort, had asked him when he thought it had started. He'd said his mid-20s, the job, the manager, the delayed report. She'd asked if it was actually earlier than that. He'd sat with that for a while. It was earlier. He knew it when he actually looked. It went back to being 12 years old and his parents' marriage coming apart in the way that certain marriages came apart. Not with a single breaking event, but with years of managed distance. Two people who had learned to keep the hard things from each other, to avoid the cost of saying them, until the unsaid things filled all the available space and there was nothing left to be together in. He'd watched that. He'd watched two people who loved each other lose each other to the accumulated weight of everything they'd decided was too hard to say. He'd told himself he'd be different. And then he'd replicated it almost exactly, in the specific way children replicated the damage of their parents. Not deliberately, not even consciously, but with an accuracy that was its own kind of inheritance. "I thought I was protecting people," he told Dr. Yuen. "From what?" "From having to deal with my complicated parts." "What were you actually protecting?" Long pause. "Myself," he said, "from the chance that the complicated parts would be too much." Dr. Ewan nodded. She didn't say he was right, but she also didn't say he wasn't, and that absence of contradiction had a weight he'd learned to take seriously. He drove home from that session thinking about his parents, not with the bitterness he'd sometimes carried, but with the more complicated feeling that arrived when you finally understood that people's damage was rarely malicious and almost always inherited, passed forward in the absence of better tools, and that the breaking of a pattern required not just the recognition of it, but the daily, imperfect, repeated decision to do otherwise. He thought about Sophie asking him if the bad situation at work was going to be okay. He thought about her saying, "You're not supposed to do everything by yourself," 6 years old. She hadn't gotten it from him. Or rather, she'd gotten the opposite of it from watching what alone actually looked like, and had decided, with the decisive clarity of a child who hadn't yet learned to second-guess herself, that it was worse. He was grateful for her in a way that didn't fit inside normal gratitude. She'd been teaching him things since she was old enough to have opinions about music and furniture and the importance of being perceptive, and he hadn't always been a good enough student. He was working on it. Logan called Marcus in early May and said he wanted to apologize. Marcus said, "For what?" "For spending a year and a half telling you I had things handled when I didn't. For not taking seriously what you said about telling Ava. For making you sit in that kitchen and say the hard thing to me when it should have been obvious without you having to say it." Silence on Marcus's end. "Also," Logan said, "for the blind date thing. You were right. I should have gone years ago." Marcus cleared his throat. "I'm not going to make this easy on you. I know. You're apologizing for a decade of being terrible at accepting help, which means this apology covers years I haven't even listed yet. Yeah. It's a lot to process. Take your time." Another pause, then, "I'm glad you figured it out, even as late as you did." A beat. "You're buying lunch next Thursday." Done. "And you have to stop making me say the obvious thing. I'm your friend, not your life coach." "I know. I'm working on it." "Good." A pause that had something warm and unspoken in it, the kind that lasted friendships. "I mean it, man. I'm glad." "Me too," Logan said. "Me too." On a Saturday morning in late May, Logan moved the couch. He did it without announcing it, while Sophie was at a friend's birthday party and the apartment was quiet. He moved it to face the window, the big east-facing one that caught the morning light, and stood back and looked at it. It was better. He wasn't going to say that out loud, but it was better. That evening, Ava came over for dinner. She walked in, handed him a bottle of wine, and stopped in the living room doorway. She looked at the couch. Then she looked at him. "Don't say anything," he said. "I'm not saying anything." "The look is saying something." She turned away toward the kitchen, and he could see from the line of her shoulders that she was working very hard not to smile. Sophie came home an hour later, still buzzing from the birthday party, and walked into the living room and stopped dead. She looked at the couch. She looked at Logan. She looked at Ava. "I told you," she said, with the serene vindication of someone who had known all along. "You did tell me," Logan said. "Months ago." "Yes." She considered him for a moment with those steady, unsparing eyes. Then she went to sit on the couch in its new position and looked out the window at the evening street and the May light on the buildings, and said, "This is much better." "Yeah," Logan said. "It is." There is something that no one tells you about the end of a difficult chapter, which is that it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a Wednesday. It feels like dinner and a moved couch and a kid eating birthday cake leftovers from a Ziploc bag on a couch that finally faces the right direction. It feels like the particular ordinariness that turns out to be the thing you were fighting for the whole time. Logan Hayes had spent the better part of his adult life believing that the safest way to love people was to present them with the managed version of yourself. The version with the difficult parts handled in private, the complications kept off the table until they couldn't be kept off anymore. He'd believed this so thoroughly that he'd mistaken it for consideration. He'd dressed fear in the clothing of care and worn it for a decade. What he'd learned, in the specific and costly way that people learned the things they were most resistant to, was this. You cannot be loved in the places you keep hidden. You can be liked there, admired there, found agreeable there. But love, the real kind, the kind that holds when things break, moves into the places you let it, and you have to let it in. He wasn't fixed. That word didn't really apply to people. He still went quiet sometimes when he should say something. He still felt the pull toward managing situations rather than sharing them. Dr. Yuen had told him that a pattern formed over 30 years didn't dissolve in 3 months, and she was right. And he'd made his peace with the fact that better was not the same as finished. But he was different in the ways that counted. He told Sophie things now. Not everything. She was 7 and there were age-appropriate limits. But the real things, the shape of what was actually happening, because she demonstrated comprehensively that she could handle it, and that handling it together was better than handling it alone. She was going to be a person with high standards for honesty and low tolerance for evasion, and that was partly his doing and partly just who she'd always been, and he was prouder of her than he had language for. He told Ava things when they were happening, not always perfectly, but sometimes he still caught himself 2 days into a silence he should have broken sooner, but he caught it now, and that was different from before. She'd told him that catching it was enough, that she didn't need him to be transparent effortlessly. She needed him to keep trying, and to tell her when he was struggling with it. That had rearranged something in him. The idea that the effort itself was visible and valued, not just the outcome. Ava had her own rearranging to do. She'd started talking to her own therapist in April, not as a direct result of Logan's sessions, just the recognition that the same period that had tested him had shown her some things about herself she hadn't been looking at. She'd told Logan about this in the casual way she told him things now, with the ease of someone who'd decided that casual was the correct register for honesty between two people who trusted each other. She was working on the things she'd identified herself, the way she treated control as synonymous with safety, and the places where that was costing her. They were both, in their particular ways, students of the same lesson, just taking different routes to it. The spring moved into summer the way it always did. Not with a clear transition, but with a gradual warming, the days stretching, the trees on Callister Avenue going full green, Sophie ending the school year with a drawing portfolio that her teacher framed and displayed in the hallway for the last week of term. In June, Logan had lunch with Patricia from HR, which was a thing he hadn't expected to want to do, but found himself genuinely glad he'd arranged. She was different outside the formal structure of her office. Warmer, more direct, capable of acknowledging that the process had been imperfect, and that the company's initial failure to flag the authentication issues in the documents earlier had cost him time and real harm. She didn't say this as a legal statement. She said it as a person. He appreciated that. For what it's worth, she said, the way you handled yourself in that room, the hearing, it mattered. You weren't angry in a way that made it harder to take you seriously. That's harder than it looks. I had a good lawyer. You had a good lawyer and you kept your head. Both things. He thought about that on the drive home. He thought about the version of himself that might have walked into that room 2 years ago. Tighter, more defended, more likely to lead with resentment. He thought about the fact that losing almost everything had, in the specific and painful way that certain kinds of loss worked, given him back something he hadn't known he'd been without. He didn't romanticize it. He wouldn't have chosen the 2 months if he'd had the option. The fear of losing his job, the suspended access, the fabricated record, the weeks of not knowing, none of it was an experience he'd frame as a gift. It was damage, and it had cost him, and the people who had orchestrated it had acted with a cruelty that he hoped the regulatory process would address. But it had broken the pattern, and the pattern had needed to be broken. On a Sunday morning in late June, Logan and Sophie and Ava were at the farmers market on the east side, the one that ran through 3 city blocks, where they'd had their first real conversation about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. It had become a monthly ritual without anyone deciding it would be, which was how the best rituals arrived. Sophie had found a vendor selling architectural prints, buildings photographed from unusual angles, perspectives that made familiar structures look foreign and newly interesting, and was engaged in a serious negotiation with the vendor, a young man who seemed somewhat startled to be in a considered business discussion with a 7-year-old. Logan had given her his wallet with a 20 in it, and she was managing the transaction entirely herself. He and Ava stood back and watched. "She's going to be extraordinary," Ava said. "She already is. I mean in the world, as an adult. She's going to walk into rooms and people are going to feel it. Logan watched his daughter hold the print up and examine it critically and asked the vendor a question about the angle of the shot that the vendor had to actually think about before answering. He thought about the morning he'd found her at the kitchen table with her forehead doing the concentration crease, working on the building design with the windows for the afternoon light. He thought about her asking him if the bad situation was going to be okay, and then making soup because soup helped. "She's been extraordinary," he said, "since before I knew what to do with it." Ava looked at him. The morning light was doing something warm on everything, the kind of June light that was generous and unearned, and she was looking at him the way she'd looked at things she'd decided to keep, with attention that was settled rather than searching. "Logan," she said. "Yeah. I love you." Just plainly, again. She said it the same way each time, not with fanfare, not with the weight of occasion, just with the simple accuracy of a true statement delivered by someone who'd decided it was worth delivering. He looked at her. At the market around them, at Sophie currently completing her transaction with visible satisfaction, at the June morning and the warmth of it, and the river visible at the end of the block doing something silver in the light. He thought about the blind date he'd almost canceled. He thought about the corner booth at Callaway's, and the woman who'd arrived and poured her own water with the same practicality he'd used 30 seconds before. He thought about 2.5 hours becoming the longest he'd gone without checking his phone in years, and the walk to his car in which he'd made himself not look back, and the Wednesday text that had started with, "Are you free Saturday afternoon?" He thought about all the ways it could have not happened, the joke that wasn't supposed to work out, the two people who were not supposed to be compatible with each other's lives, who had sat down across from each other anyway and refused to leave. "I love you too," he said. "Still. More, actually." She smiled. The real one, the private one. And he held on to that. He had gotten very good at holding on to the real things. Sophie appeared beside them, print tucked under her arm, and handed Logan his wallet with the careful accounting of a 7-year-old who had managed a transaction correctly and wanted this acknowledged. "I got $3 change," she said. "Good negotiating." She held the print up. It was a photograph of a building taken from below, the lines of it converging toward a sky that was impossibly blue. "I'm going to design something like this someday," she said. "I believe that completely," Ava said. Sophie looked at the print for another moment, satisfied, and then looked at the market around her. "Can we get the pastries now?" "We can get the pastries," Logan said. She walked ahead, already navigating toward the bakery stall with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. He and Ava followed. The morning was warm and ordinary and completely, quietly, enough.